so much for joining us for Much Ado About Editing, which is a conversation about the history and significance of women, including the Shakespeare in Prison Ensemble, editing Shakespeare. And really quick, I'm going to introduce us, and then we'll start talking. And feel free, if you've got questions as we go, you can put them in the chat, you can use the Q&A. But we definitely, like, if there's stuff you want to talk about, like, let's talk about it. So my name is Franny Shepard Bates, and I'm the director of Shakespeare in Prison, which is Detroit Public Theater's signature community program. And to make a long, wonderful story short, we use Shakespeare and theater as a catalyst for empowerment, for working with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people for the last 10 years. And that's the story about that. We're going to have fun and be super casual tonight. So joining me this evening are Jessica Christopher, who was a Shakespeare in Prison Ensemble member for 4 years and remains involved with Shakespeare Reclaimed, which is our post-release extension, including as a contributor to our upcoming critical edition of Richard III, which will be the first critical edition of a Shakespeare play written by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. Jessica is the communications director for 70x7 Life Recovery, which is an organization in West Michigan that serves individuals impacted by the criminal justice system. She is a person in long-term recovery and attributes much of her 9 years of sobriety to her involvement in Shakespeare in Prison. And she is the quote unquote cut queen of the Shakespeare in Prison Women's Ensemble. When she left the ensemble, we were like, how are we ever going to know how to cut Shakespeare again? We did figure it out, but she is still the queen. We are also joined by Sierra Byers, who joined Shakespeare in Prison in 2014 and has pretty much never left. She played Cassio in Othello and Richard III. She's also a contributor to Richard III in Prison, and she is a popular creator on TikTok. We should be joined by another alum shortly, and when she does join, we'll introduce her. But we are also joined by Molly Yarn, who is the author of this amazing book, Shakespeare's Lady Editors, A New History of the Shakespearean Text. She is a co-editor of the RSC Shakespeare, The Complete Works Revised Edition. She is an independent scholar, a freelance editor, a theater practitioner. She'll be the, I should have figured out that I knew how to pronounce, what is it? I'm so embarrassed. Is it Monticello or Monticello? Which is it?
I actually haven't asked which way they pronounce it, so you're
Cool.
fine.
Great. Great. So one of those two, College Foundation Fellowship for Women and Mellon Foundation Fellow at the Newberry Library for 2022 to 23, as well as a James M. Osborne Fellow at Yale's, is it Beinecke?
Beinecke, yeah.
Thank you, Library, and a Catherine F. Pantzer Fellow at Harvard's Houghton Library. And she also curates the Rasmussen Hines collection. And I hope that nobody is mad at me about the way that I pronounced any of those things. Anyway, so thank you very much. What we are here to do, so here's the genesis of this webinar is Shakespeare in Prison is on Twitter, FYI, and often that is me. And I was scrolling through Twitter and I saw that Molly's book was coming out. I don't remember who posted about it. And I was like, oh, that looks interesting. And then I looked into it more and I was like, I want to talk to this person because I'm so interested in what she's doing. And I think she might be interested in what we're doing. And so Molly and our Shakespeare in Prison's assistant director, Matthew Van Meter, who's here behind the scenes, we all got on Zoom and we talked and we were like, oh, we really need to like loop some alums into this conversation. And then when I read the book, you could see all the tabs. There's also like highlighting in pencil and it's like really nerdy and embarrassing. And I was like, we need to have this conversation. We need to bring more people into it. So we're super glad you're all here to join us. And we're just gonna talk about the work and editing Shakespeare and just kind of, I've got some ideas, but we're gonna see what comes up.
Yay.
What, Sarah?
I said, yay.
Yay! So is there anything that I left out of your intros that you would like to add?
No, you kept it short and sweet for me. I like it.
Great. Okay. Well, why don't we just because the webinar, the idea for the webinar came from the excitement about this awesome book.
Yay, Jocelyn.
Oh, Jocelyn's here. Great. Jocelyn Walker. Where are you, Jocelyn?
Guys.
There you are.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, you're
Sideways.
sideways.
Oh, gosh.
That's okay.
Apologies. So trash.
You had one job, Jocelyn.
Jocelyn, we're so glad you're here. Jocelyn, I'm scrolling back to your bio. Jocelyn Walker was a Shakespeare Prison Ensemble member for 2 years and is a very active member of Shakespeare Reclaimed. She has always loved theater and has participated in school and church plays and musicals. She's the co-owner of a 501c3 called B&C Productions 1820, which was a company inspired by her and her partner's sisters who passed away due to gun violence at the ages of 18 and 20. B&C Productions uses performing arts and creativity to give youth an opportunity to express themselves as an outlet, helping them avoid troublesome outcomes. Jocelyn recently graduated from cosmetology school. Yay.
Yes.
And is the owner of Revived Styles LLC. She's very passionate and purpose-driven and will do anything in her power to succeed in life, as should we all.
I know that's right.
Hi, Jocelyn.
Hi, guys.
So, okay, so what we're going to do now is, Molly, could you please describe your research in your book, and then we can go from there.
Sure, absolutely. And Franny, there's as a book person, I can tell you there's absolutely nothing embarrassing about having too many tabs and highlights in a book. There's no such thing as too many. So the sort of roots of this book came from my experience as a graduate student when I went to a program and I met a lot of professors who were involved in editing Shakespeare. And for those of you who don't have a lot of sort of experience with the technical idea of editing, every time every lovely, neat, modern edition of a Shakespeare play that you use or read or used in school has passed through so many hands before it's come to you to create that, including people who make decisions about the smallest things, such as the punctuation that's used, how things are spelled, and even bigger as to sort of which scenes are included in certain versions of certain plays, or what word is what in a certain line that can change the meaning of the whole thing. So it's a huge part of Shakespeare studies that sort of isn't always visible, but kind of undergirds the whole process for everybody ultimately. And it's got a long tradition. It's something that has been, people have been editing Shakespeare really since it was written in a lot of ways, but the people who we know for doing it are almost exclusively men. And by the sort of 1970s, 1980s, in conjunction with sort of what was going on in the feminist movement at that time in academia, there was a big push to basically bring women into the editorial field, which was still at that time really exclusively dominated by men. And one of the women who was very involved in the vanguard of that was a woman named Ann Thompson, who was a professor of mine. And I became really interested in not only what her story personally as an editor, but in things that she had researched about past women editors whose work had been forgotten. And there were sort of a couple who were known, and there were, articles about a couple of them. And so I thought, well, this is a great project. This is something that I really want to learn more about. I want to research it. I want to write about it myself. So I did. So the book is the published version of a dissertation, and I started knowing sort of 12 or 13 names of women editors between 1800 and 1950, which was the kind of arbitrary time limit that I set myself, and I ended up with almost 70, a lot of whom were sort of forgotten history, and whose books might exist in very few copies at this point. So that's what the book is. And to me, it's all really, what I love about it is that it's about Shakespeare. It's about, it's about words and books, but it's also really, it's about their lives and the things that they went through, not only just to live and to be human, but the things that they had to go through in order to become editors, because there were a lot of factors working against them being being allowed essentially to do this job and to be recognized for doing this job. So that's sort of a little intro to the book concept. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk about it with y'all. I'm thrilled. So
are we. And it was that like that last bit that I think, made me want to like get y'all in conversation with each other, of that the women being allowed to edit Shakespeare or not. And that kind of, that we don't know about so many of them, and how did this happen, and what were their lives like, and what kind of were the personal or systemic issues here. Mm-hmm. And it made me think about things that we've talked about in the ensemble, and in the women's ensemble in particular. And so Jessica, Sierra, Jocelyn, anyone in listening to Molly describing her book, does anything come to mind, like any ideas sparked or anything? Like, I mean, what comes to mind, if anything?
Well, for me, I was just thinking of all the movies that I've seen with stuff like that, like 9 to 5, or that one lady that was a news reporter that had to fight tooth and nail just to be able to, I don't even remember what it's called, but I just started thinking about all the historical people that I knew that were trying to do things like that. And I think it's really amazing. I love history, so I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what academia was like for women before sort of the 1850s, 1860s, when sort of women's colleges started to open up, and a few of them became coeducational slowly, and it was because it was considered that women didn't need to have this sort of an education. So and of course many of them wanted it, and more of them would have wanted it if they had sort of known what was out there and what they could have had.
Right.
But yeah, it was a fight, and even once they were sort of allowed in, they always had to fight against prejudice and misogyny, and being paid less, having less support to deal. A lot of them had to leave their profession if they got married. There was sort of an expectation, almost an official rule, official in some cases, that if you got married, you had to leave your university job. Mm-hmm. They had to make a lot of decisions and give up a lot to be full-time academics at that time, which is still true in a lot of ways, but in a different way.
Yeah, one of my favorite ones is God, I cannot remember her name or the movie, but she worked in NASA, and she was a Black woman. And even then, like, she had to run like miles just to go to the bathroom, and then coming back, and she was the one that actually like solved everything.
Yeah,
with the separation of women and men, color, and the fact that she was smarter than everybody.
Yeah, it's a lot of having to prove yourself for still for
very powerful women.
Yeah.
And to like, oh, Jessica, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to ask Molly if she has a favorite lady editor.
I have a couple who I really love. Some like one who I sort of kind of more discovered myself, who the edition was published anonymously, so I linked it to her through other sources, and I realized she had, when she was young, she had, been a governess and moved to India with a family, and come back and become a novelist. She'd married and been widowed very young and was living in poverty, and started working for this publisher, and ended up, editing Shakespeare and Milton and doing all of these things. And so I love the humanity of her story and some of the archival material that I found to do with her. I also love, there's one woman who is actually still pretty well known in Ireland. Her name was Dorothy McCardle, and she was Irish, and she had left and was living in England. And at the time, this was in the early 20th century, England was still ruling over Ireland, but there were a lot of rebellions. There was sort of a growing rebellion, and she moved back to take part in that, and became sort of an Irish revolutionary, and that she was arrested. That's why she didn't, I think that's why she didn't edit any more Shakespeare. She was arrested, she was in prison, and was involved in like the hunger strikes that those women were doing to protest their treatment. And yeah, so it's I have a lot that I love, but a few who I'm particularly fond of, I have to say. Yeah.
Yeah, she sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things I wondered about, like, you know, in terms of who's allowed to do this kind of work, or who's, you know, who's supposed to be in charge of Shakespeare, who's the authority, you know, who's the expert. I don't know, dude's been dead for 400 years, so you know, at this point, who knows. But I wonder for Jessica or Jocelyn or Sierra, like, so many ensemble members come into Shakespeare in prison, and this is part of why we're doing this critical edition of Richard III too, is it because people come in and obviously, like, people in prison, like, are not like a stereotype, right? Like, it's everybody coming from all backgrounds with all sorts of different, you know, ideas and things. But it seems like overwhelmingly people tend to feel like there are barriers between themselves and Shakespeare, or like, you know, someone else is in charge, is the authority, that this Shakespeare is for certain people. And like in the case of these, you know, like, you know, not being able to find these lady editors, you know, that maybe they were not allowed to be the authorities, or they were not allowed to continue their careers if they got married. And so I wonder if any of you would like to speak about either yourselves or what you observed in other ensemble members, the feeling of owning Shakespeare, because in Shakespeare in Prison, where nobody's teaching, nobody's directing, we're just working collaboratively on a play together, and what it feels like to take that text and do what you want with it, and know that, like, you don't, like, it is yours and it is for you, and it is everyone's, and it is for everyone. Does anyone want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, having had experience with theater before, where you had a director, and a director was kind of, depending on the director, kind of pushing their own agenda sometimes. And so there's kind of relief in that. And then there's, you know, it's kind of frustrating, but we all got to really develop our own characters, and a lot of that did come through cutting the lines. So I guess it's interesting to, like, think back on being a part of something where we didn't have ownership in it. And I guess I kind of took that for granted. But I think that there were some ensemble members who didn't feel like they had a lot of ownership in Shakespeare per se, until they were able to kind of identify with a certain character. And then after that, it was like they were off running. And then they could really, you know, start to identify with the other characters as well, or at least have empathy for those characters, or the women that did identify with them. We talk about how safe it is to do Shakespeare in prison, as far as, like, we do identify with the characters. So it's easy for us to talk about, you know, I understand why Richard did this, but not saying, well, I get that because I would have done the same thing. So there's a lot of talk about not judging characters, but I think that's what we should do in all of life. Like, people don't want to hurt other people generally, like hurt people. And, you know, once we can kind of look at that as kind of the theme in Shakespeare, like, everybody, they are motivated by different things, but they've all had different experiences. And I kind of wonder if that's, well, I would imagine that that's used in editing for the lady editors too. You know, they're people. So you can't just separate what you've been through in life from your job, as much as some of us may want to. That's what makes us good at our jobs and, you know, good at, you know, participating in an ensemble. But it's always interesting because like there are certain characters that I do not care about. Like if you talk about them, I don't even remember what play that was because I didn't identify with that character. But then there's others that, you know, I feel like in my soul, you know, like when somebody says something still to this day, like you're like, oh, that was really Richard-esque, or you know, that sounds like something Iago would have said. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I just told you one. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, and yeah, I definitely want to hear from Sierra and Jocelyn too, but it my own, like what that made me think of is, Molly, you did write about one of the things that you were writing about was exactly what Jessica said, was that any editor is going to bring themselves to the text. And which is part of why it's like, who gets to be the authority on Shakespeare, is that everybody brings themselves necessarily to the text, because that's how that works. And it made me think about especially in the early years of Shakespeare in Prison, but all the way through it, the way that the ensemble, and particularly the women's ensemble, took ownership of the text to make it work for the group overall and for individuals. And so like, you know, Jocelyn and Jessica, you both worked on Romeo and Juliet and Taming of the Shrew. And then Jessica, you worked on Richard III, which Sierra's when you know, Othello, which is Sierra when you joined. And then both of you worked on Richard III. And then Sierra also worked on Macbeth.
Which was awesome because we were in the same unit too. So it was easy to try to practice the lines and stuff together.
Yeah, you guys were Iago and Cassio. And Jocelyn and Jessica were, well, Jocelyn was Romeo, Jessica was Capulet, then you two were Kate and Petruchio. So like, in terms of like what you as an ensemble member and the ensemble as a whole did with those texts, like thinking about the way that because we always have to do them in 90 minutes or less. There is no Shakespeare play you can just sort of like do in 90 minutes. So it means that the group really has to take that script and just like, you know, dismantle it, not
just cut it,
but like you really have
ripping
to
pages out,
like slicing and dicing.
Yeah.
Jocelyn, what are your memories of that from Romeo and Juliet or Taming of the Shrew or both?
Honestly, I feel like from the edits, when they were done, we always took like the meat of whatever Shakespeare was trying to portray or what we gathered from what he was saying. We will always take the meat of that and like really amp it up so that what we're gathering is what we're portraying as well. So I think when we did edit, it kind of made us all dig deeper to really figure out like, okay, what are we trying to say here? And when we're saying it, what would be the best way to give it off? So I think with the edits, it also pushed us as actors and individuals to like really dig deep to be like, okay, well, how can I dig deeper and really feel Petruchio? Like I remember one time when we were doing one of our rehearsals and I had realized like I actually felt whatever Petruchio would have felt in that moment. This is the end when Katerina, when you were doing your spiel on how you had finally, I guess, became tamed, and I felt his, like what he might have felt in that moment. And it was just like an amazing feeling because prior to being an SIP, I had never read a Shakespeare play. So to have dig deep into something that I was unaware of and unexposed to, and I was still able to relate and portray like what I was feeling or what he might have felt in that moment, I felt was like really awesome. So due to those edits, I think we were all able to like pull out the best of ourselves.
Yeah. And can we stay on Shrew for just a minute here? Yeah. And then I want to hear what you have to say, Sierra, too. But speaking of what Petruchio may have felt in that moment, I'd love it, Jessica and Jocelyn, if you could, you know, for a minute or two or however long we need, talk about the women's ensemble, the way that, because I mostly took a back seat to what was going on with the way that we told that story. But the play was chosen specifically because we wanted to address issues of domestic abuse and trauma. And then we wound up interpreting and editing the play in a way that I feel strongly honored the text, but that the priority was the emotional safety of the ensemble and our audience, which is very specifically incarcerated women. So that wound up being a pretty unusual way of telling the story. So I wonder if you two could just kind of jam about that for a second here and tell our audience who did not get to be part of that amazing experience, and Molly and Sierra who didn't get to be part of that amazing experience, what did we do? What did you do? What did the ensemble do?
You go
I
first.
thought it was funny, that Jocelyn called me Katerina, not Jessica. And I really want to hear how you felt in that final scene. Because that was my favorite season. That was my favorite play to perform. It's definitely not even in the top 5 of Shakespeare's plays for me. But I felt like the ensemble was really committed to honoring the story, but also honoring the women that would be watching the story. I'm gonna get choked up, but
It's okay.
when we picked it, I don't really even think that it wasn't picked because of that. And then so we picked it, and then we came back a few months later and started to dig into it, and there was an ensemble member who kind of had been like on the fringes up until this point, but she basically, stood her ground and said, this is about domestic violence, and we need to honor that, and we need to talk about this. And she kind of told some of her feelings and how she had been triggered by it, which was huge. And I feel like that allowed for us to trust one another in a way that we hadn't before. And so even just out of respect and love for that one woman, we were going to make sure that she felt safe while we were doing this play. I think that our audience, I don't know that those that hadn't read the play may not have ever known that this was about domestic violence, or maybe even to another extreme, that because of their life experiences, they don't realize that it's domestic violence, so it's just what they've accepted as normal, and what isn't acceptable. So we did try to play it where and thankfully I got to do this with Jocelyn. So I did feel, safe about it. And up until that point, I hadn't really been a survivor of domestic violence. So I felt okay playing that role. But, we tried to keep it kind of lighthearted, but also like there was a connection between the two. And they were both stubborn and they wanted their way. But not so much where Petruchio was lording over Katerina. It was both ways, and I mean, the comedic relief, just like some of the small choices we made about like riding a horse like on a stick, like, stuff like that, so that if women were feeling triggered by it, that would kind of break it up, because the audience would laugh, and that just kind of lightens the mood a little bit. Yeah. But I'll let Jocelyn intercede there.
What was I gonna say? It was definitely a different approach for all of us, really, because when you look at The Taming of the Shrew and how much it really does deal with the domestic violence, like I don't even think to the extent when we chose that play that we even understood that dynamic that we would have to portray. So as we started to dig deeper into it, I started to see a different spin on it. And I don't know if this is me trying to make light of the tough situation that we were trying to do or whatever, but I felt like Petruchio and Katerina were somewhat of like twin flames. So although they say like he tamed her in a way, like I feel like he was able to allow her to let her guard down with him. And that last scene when you're like saying everything that you're saying, I felt like that was the moment where she's like, okay, well now I feel safe with him and he understands me, and okay, now maybe I can't let my guard down. I'm not this mean shrew that everyone's saying that I am. Like there's more to me, and I'm kind of ready to let that out now. And that's what I received when we were reading it, and I'm like, we have to play it like that. It's only right. So I think with that spin, it kind of gave like a different light, shed a different light on like the tough situation, because there was definitely a lot of different type of abuse that Petruchio was doing with the verbal, and like it was a lot. So
Yeah.
with that spin, it was just it was a lighthearted thing once we put that spin on it, for sure.
Yeah.
Can I ask all three of you a question about sort of what the process is like? Like when you start with a text, and because what I think Franny, you said, and from what I understand, you sort of get the whole text, right? And then you make the decisions yourselves about cuts, correct? So what does that process look like? Like what when you're in the room, how do y'all do that?
I did a lot of pacing when I would read mine, and I was actually going to be saying this about whatever, I don't even remember what the first question was, but I took notes. But for me, it was learning how to slow down, because I don't do anything slow, and realize that his text is in a rhythm. So it's like bum, ba bum, ba bum. So I always kind of kept that rhythm, and I would keep that pace as I was pacing back and forth myself. I always used plenty of colorful sticky notes to this day for my script. So I knew like which scene was what, where I was going to cut something out, where I wasn't going to cut something out. I color coded everything. I still do that.
Tab buddies.
Yep.
Sarah, you were a really generous collaborator in terms of figuring out which lines to cut and which lines not to. Yeah, we start with the entire thing and then we go from there.
Well, when you got the cut queen and the one that's okay to cut everything, it worked out perfect.
Right. You two
Because then Michaela had plenty.
Yeah. Michaela played several leading roles and is well known for wanting to keep all of her lines. And so Jessica then would step in. And yeah, Molly, that's such a good question. I
was always kind of like the hype man too. Like I was always getting everybody like hyped up, and every single day I'd be like, I'm quitting.
Yeah.
I quit.
Jessica, do you remember when we the first text that we really cut as a group with a group mindset was Romeo and Juliet? Do you remember? I remember very well that day sitting around the table and figuring out how to make pretty drastic cuts so that the ensemble could like do what it needed to do. And I think that's a part of how we developed our process, Molly, is starting with that first day and all that, like,
yeah. So I mean, it comes back to kind of what Molly was talking about. I don't know if it's prior to when we actually started recording, but a lot of the cuts that people make in Shakespeare are because of you have to. So you only have so much time to perform, or you only have so many actors, and hey, someone's playing two roles and they can't do that on stage. Like they can only play one role. So that's why a lot of cuts are made, but that's what it was like for us too. There's a lot of change that isn't really, you can't control it inside there. So we lost a lot of ensemble members to situations. And so people would jump into roles and they may only have 3 weeks to learn the lines. Well, we just want them there and we want them to feel comfortable. So that means we're cutting lines for them. And so as much as it like may have hurt other, like it doesn't hurt the
just
ensemble. We
sucks.
joke about it. Yeah. But it's funny because like I don't know the lines that we cut anymore. Like I just think of the way that we cut it. And I think that, so Michaela, we love her, but she would get very attached to certain lines. And I would just know that by the end, she's gonna cut them because she has a lot of lines to memorize. She's busy. So, but we all lived together in the same unit at one point, and it was funny because it would just be kind of like
Back and forth. I'm cutting. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're
yeah,
not.
I'm cutting. Yeah. But so the process was basically like we would all come together, but then at the end, like near performance time, it was just, oh, by the way, I cut that as we're running the scene. And
Or
everyone's
sometimes
like,
we
"Okay,
just
cool."
forget to say the line just to move along.
I don't know who did that. That's weird, Sarah.
You're right. So there would be
Yeah,
some
that's really
cut,
weird.
like what we wouldn't start cutting until after casting had been done, which was also everything we do is collaborative. So casting was collaborative as well. And then I think we would usually kind of throughout the process of, because it's a 9-month process. So that would be at the end of like the 4th month usually. Then we would spend about 5 months as we work towards staging it, editing as we go. And then, yeah, that picks up steam as we go on. And sometimes people would be like, Franny, can you take a pass at this scene or whatever? And the key being that whatever cuts I proposed were just proposals, and that it took sometimes the entire ensemble or the people in the scene to approve or not. Jessica, I remember one time me being like, we can cut this speech. And you were like, no, I need that one. And I was like, okay, cool. That was like the one time.
I did.
Yes, you were like, no, I need that one. And I was like,
What was it?
it
think it
was
was,
something,
Richard.
some Elizabeth line in Richard III that you were like, this speech stays. I was like, if you want to
You
keep
were
it,
very
then
you pulled Michaela that day.
it needs to
Did
be
I end
there.
up actually performing it?
Yes.
Okay.
It was
Yeah.
a good speech.
But so yeah, so some of it will happen intentionally and slowly over time, and some of it does happen more or less on the fly.
Well, and we all make sure that everybody feels like safe and secure and stuff like that, with like trust and everything. It was kind of like our own little family. So like people like when I first performed, I was terrified to go on stage, but like I didn't even want to stay. But you and Michaela,
I had to
were
go
just
find
like,
you in the bathroom.
Yep. And then I just ended up getting comfortable with it and feeling a sense of like a family that I never kind of had. And then I just was good with it.
And
So it comes a lot of making people comfortable.
When y'all are sort of working through it, and I know I think Franny had told me previously, right, that y'all have like printed out scripts that you are given. Is that? But do different people sort of like look at different versions? Do they do research on their own? What's the sort of, I'm sure everybody has their own process. It's the same with actors everywhere, but sort of what is some of the things that y'all sort of like to do? Do you look at different editions or?
We have the traditional edition with the new age edition, so we could read it in English and then see what it was really written like. So it kind of gave us a better idea of what it was saying.
Yeah, so we'll have, and this is an innovation that happened over time and with much debate and growing budgets, is that the ensemble will work with both one of the dreaded No Fear Shakespeares, which who gets to say that, that those spark notes Shakespeare's are not, they're very useful for a lot of people. And I used to be a snob and I would say, oh, the No Fears, they're blah, 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 blah. They dumb down the process.
No,
and they
they're
so do not. And then some ensemble members like to work only with that. And then some prefer like an Arden or a Cambridge or a Folger, some will work with both, some just one or the other. But when we actually start, which makes for very rich conversation and means that everybody, even if they're not there, can keep up on the story. And so we spend much less time re-summarizing the plot and much more time digging into the language. And so I was wrong about the No Fears, and I will say it a million times, I was wrong. That was a great idea. And then yeah, once we start like really actively editing and rehearsing, then we have the printed out script because it's easier to work with.
Mhm.
And they all fall apart and then we bring in new ones.
Yeah. Bad.
And there's I can think of one person that comes to mind that became kind of like our resident dramaturg, and she would go to the library just to research about whatever play we were doing, and she'd come back with little facts and ask her family to look up, whatever they could. And so yeah, I mean, there was as much research as can be done, I guess.
And
But
and this is where it's like, one woman I was talking to an alum a while back about legitimate concerns about what is often referred to as colonizing with Shakespeare, is taking somebody who is a supposed authority on this or has a degree of privilege, sort of bringing it into a community and saying like, this is, whatever, here it is and here is what it should be. And her take was, well, yeah, that's not the way to do it, but the way you guys do it should be being done, because if nobody who has access to like the internet or other books or things like that, if nobody is working with folks in prison with material like that, who has the privilege that can be used to access that information, like, yeah, she was an amazing dramaturg. She knew what to ask other people to look up, who had that access. And that's part of where, in terms of the history and the context of women editing Shakespeare. You wrote, Molly, about some women who were really uplifted by male editors who were their mentors, or, made sure their names were included, as opposed to those who were virtually erased by them.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I was thinking while I was reading the book so much about that, what can be problematic in somebody who has, whatever, even like internet access, maybe inadvertently holding on to Shakespeare, like talking too much or whatever, and where that is useful and where it can be oppressive, and that is what led me to kind of think about where this ensemble's work figures into that larger context, in general, and then in particular working on this critical edition of Richard III. And so, I wonder about, we haven't talked yet about domestic texts, Molly, which when you and Matt and I talked a while back, was something that we were thinking about. Was it's a critical edition of Richard III. It's the first of its kind, because there's never been a critical edition of Shakespeare written by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, and women specifically too. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about domestic texts. And I don't even know, because Richard III in prison is meant to be, a way of, on the one hand, creating access, right, for people, because Shakespeare is owned by everybody, and also of bringing voices into the conversation in academia and theater industry where nobody's been listening. And saying, nobody's voice is more valuable than anybody else's. We should all be in dialogue together. So I couldn't figure out where this book fit. And I don't know if you wanted to kind of like dig into that for a minute, and we can see if we can maybe figure it out together before we've got some good questions in the chat that I know I want to get to, but I have a burning question about this.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like it comes back to sort of what you were talking about with the no fear and everything. In a way, I think we tend to think of Shakespeare editions, particularly, for people who aren't specialists, and that even goes for people who have PhDs in Shakespeare. There are plenty of them who are not specialists in text and don't really think that much about the text because that isn't what they're interested in, And I think it can tend to be thought of as sort of, a kind of a homogenous thing or kind of a monolithic thing. Like they're all just sort of Shakespeare texts and they're all kind of similar. But when you dig into it, like every text is produced for a different reason, for a different audience, for a different market. Some of them a lot of them are meant for teaching, and that really shapes how they're developed and what they say. And what I write about in the book, the sort of grouping that I call the domestic texts are something that developed in the 19th century, particularly as women start to be offered more chances at education. There are Shakespeare editions that are specifically developed that didn't exist before, that are for children, that are for women, and that are for people from working class backgrounds, because there's a whole revolution happening in terms of who gets to get educated. So at the same time, what you see is a development of editions, because there are people higher up who are saying, well, we need to either in some way we need to control how we're teaching them, like what they get access to. And that can be done in sort of an oppressive way, like we were talking about, but it can also be done in a way that is, well, we want to explain, we want to teach, we want to give information. So it's something, student texts are sort of considered kind of a lesser, a sort of a less, they're certainly not thought of in the same way that, like the Ardens are, the sort of big, heavy, serious tomes. But they're an incredibly important category of text. That's the first kind of text that most people encounter as children. When you're in school and you read a Shakespeare play, that's usually the sort of thing that you're seeing. So that to me is really what I find interesting about your project is to keep thinking more about the fact that that text can be for different people, that they can be for different audiences, that they can be for different purposes. And as you said earlier, Franny, that each editor or each group of editors in this case brings both their own experience and sort of their hopes for what people are going to get out of their edition to their process. Yeah, I find your all's whole project really like exciting. Super exciting, both the collaborative nature of it and the idea that it is meant to serve not a wider audience, but also an audience that is so underserved. I think that's so beautiful and valuable. God, I got emotional about it. I'm just talking about it. I don't even know how y'all get through talking about it. So
the idea came from the ensemble and from someone, I know, me too, from someone who said, Matt made a mock-up of what a page of a book like this might be, which when we were building on this idea that actually one of the men's ensemble members had. And that I remember when somebody said, man, if I was sitting in prison and I knew that there was a book of Shakespeare that was written by prisoners, I'd read it. Like someone who had not been into it at all, but like if I knew that there was something that was being treated seriously also, right? Mm-hmm. Is like, that's something that I thought about in terms of those domestic texts, is like, why not take them as seriously as any other? Mm-hmm. And, that some of the analysis that is ongoing in the ensemble is very much in line with traditional scholarship and everything. And some of it is not. Mm-hmm. And that's awesome because right. It's like, we need it. We need all of it. And yeah, I don't know. I'm just like getting all emotional too.
Yeah. we should take,
you guys need a hug.
Either of us starts crying.
Maybe critical editions of Shakespeare that are written by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people are forming a new editorial tradition.
I think they should.
What are any of you fabulous alums, whether Sierra and Jessica, you're both working on the book, and Jocelyn, you were part of the team that really laid the groundwork for the way the ensemble works to develop that kind of material. So as far as I'm concerned, you're a contributor as well. What do you think? I mean, how do the three of you or each of you feel about the your own work and this book as whatever it is, a representation of it or an extension of it. We want it to look like any critical edition of Shakespeare, and to feel very welcoming to people who generally feel alienated by academic looking texts.
Well, see, that was something I always kept in mind too, because I knew some of the ladies in prison, not most, but a good amount of them didn't even barely have a middle school education, let alone anything else. So I knew that they weren't going to understand the words. So I knew that I would have to sell it physically and like bring out that emotion. So I learned when I was in Shakespeare, it was very therapeutic for me. I wasn't allowed to like show emotion and stuff like that growing up, like got to be hard, got to be tough kind of thing. So in my characters, I was able to portray those feelings and emotions. Like Cassio was probably my favorite. He was probably my favorite one that I got to release all those emotions, and that was just a way for the audience to actually understand it. And there'd been a lot of times where a lot of people were like, "Oh, we didn't understand what you were saying," but once we were watching, it was just it just made sense. It was amazing.
Yeah,
So
I like
it doesn't matter how the words are; it's just how we, as actors or actresses, involve the audience, basically.
Yeah, I like that about the edition, the sample that I've seen, that in a way it kind of bridges that, right? Because it's still on the page, but because it's y'all's words and you expressing how you feel about it and your own sort of experiences and reactions to it, in really,
we're very limited on what we're allowed to do or use and stuff like that. So we really had to draw emotion out.
So it's it's really a different source of how we have explanation and sort of and conveying different things that I think is a really interesting and valuable product, I suppose you might say.
Jessica or Jocelyn, what are your thoughts about that?
I have to say, I do agree with what you said, Sierra. A lot of us trying to get what we have taken away from Shakespeare was our acting skills. Like, we really had to amp it up. A lot of people did tell me, like, yeah, I really didn't know what you guys were saying, but you guys did a heck of a job.
Yeah,
so I think people were just impressed by how we were able to take something that you just typically wouldn't see people doing. Shakespeare, like, that's not just something people just do on the regular. So I think they were more so captivated by that and how we were able to internalize it and then turn around and portray what we internalized. I think that was what really moved them. So I do agree that it had to do with what the amount of work that we put in order to portray the story.
I used to love hearing the laughters and the and like people just like, you could see the audience really getting into it.
Yeah,
definitely.
And
especially
luckily,
that sword fight, that was fun.
Sword fight
was really
great.
fun.
And luckily, and Jessica, I want to get your take on this too, especially because like there's so much Jessica in that book. It's like there's so much Jessica in the analysis, and Jessica does a Q&A with the artistic director of the Michigan Shakespeare Festival and writes an essay, and like she's the cut queen, and she's Queen Elizabeth, and like that Sierra, what you and Jocelyn are talking about, you're right, Molly, like it does. That's what makes it that what we get down on paper, which is all verbatim or as close as we can come, because we aren't allowed to take in recorders. I think so unique is the process that ensemble members go through to bring out that analysis. Some of it is just talking in a circle, and then a lot of it is on its feet from the gut and all that. Jessica, what are your thoughts about that? What are we doing with this book, and what does it mean?
With this book, well, I don't think that we wanted to do it, so we wanted a project to do together afterwards. So this is where we ended up, because we can't just stop doing it. I don't even know that we knew necessarily what we were trying to do as we were doing it. It just kind of happened. There were a lot of things that I learned about myself while we did this. I grew a lot from the time that we performed Richard to when we analyzed him critically. And I actually, a lot of what I was very adamant about, or my strong feelings had changed, which I thought was interesting. And I realized that it had everything to do with what my experiences were since we performed, and kind of taught me that I'd been a little closed-minded, even when I had prided myself on growing so much. So, we just continue to grow if we choose to. And so I think that we selfishly, like, we all got something out of it, which for
Yeah.
me was acknowledging that I still had work to do. But I think we just kind of wanted to share what we do. I mean,
Yep.
the more people that do what we've been able to do, the better.
Yeah, you and I had
not
had a few
everyone's-
conversations on you noticing your
Mhm.
qualities and stuff and the things that bothered you with your characters. I remember those days.
Because we,
Mhm.
yeah, because we worked on the play in prison in 2016, 2017. And then a bunch of us got back together over Zoom, thanks to the Michigan Humanities Council and National Endowment for the Humanities. With their support, we got back together on Zoom, and we went through it again. And yeah, that there were some people had changes, big changes in those few years where we started.
Well, I mean, even behind bars, like that's when Jess was really relating, especially to Queen Elizabeth. And I'm sorry, I don't like Queen Elizabeth. You did a great
No,
job,
me
but I didn't
neither.
like you.
No, she
But it
found
was
her
great.
place of
I
empathy.
didn't
found
even want to
yourself.
play Queen Elizabeth. I wanted to play
Mm-mm.
Queen Margaret. And then I
Yep.
got stuck with Elizabeth. But it's okay.
You were a wonderful.
You needed that part, because that's when you were really
Yeah.
starting to like see things in yourself that you wanted fixed or didn't realize.
Well, I think I saw too much Iago, so I needed to just
Oh,
chill
God,
with
yeah.
Elizabeth.
And that's
Um,
a piece of it too, right? Is that I feel like in terms of bringing yourself to the text, is that some of the stuff that is in the critical edition of Richard III comes from a very specific perspective from women who have been incarcerated.
Mhm.
There's we made videos of all these discussions, somehow cut them down from like 2 hours to like less than 10 minutes, and sometimes only 3, where like we're talking about why does Richard, what makes him decide to get rid of Buckingham, at what point does Buckingham go from being an
Right.
ally to a liability, and talking about, there's women in prison have to think like that. Like they're not this is not hard to figure out if you've been in that situation.
Mhm.
And most people who so far have had a voice in this, larger conversation about Shakespeare, they don't have that kind of perspective. And so that perspective is missing. And so, yeah. And so coming at it from that such a personal place is so valuable. Let me see what kind of questions we have here that we can answer. We have more information about Shakespeare in prison. Molly, question for you is, why did you stop at 1950 if Anne Thompson presumably was an editor 20 years after that? Or why did you choose the time period that you did? I know you said it was arbitrary, but.
No, well, yeah, I mean, arbitrary, yes, that's a really good question. A lot of it has to do with sort of just needing to have a stopping place, because when you're writing a dissertation, you have sort of a set amount of time. So you have to sort of put restrictions on what you're going to do, because you just can't look at everything. It's not possible. But, there's also, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat bit, and you said, you described her as a living witness. That's a double-edged sword, really, particularly when you're working in a field where, when you're writing about a field that you also work in, you don't necessarily want to work that much on people who are alive, because, it's sometimes you're not saying things that are nice about people when you're writing the history of a field. So there is a certain amount of value in kind of setting a cutoff date. And as it turned out, I felt like that date really worked in terms of there was sort of a shift after the 1940s, where there were fewer and fewer women editing for a few decades. So I was able to sort of talk about that and try to understand that. But yeah, a lot of the answer is just that, you kind of have a set limited amount of time, and you have to kind of set limits on yourself.
Yeah. There's a question here about a 9-month process like a birth. Was that intentional? sort of. Prior to that, we'd been going year round, and then I was pregnant, and we figured we were working on The Tempest, and we figured we probably wanted to perform before I had a baby. So we did. We were like, okay, 9 months. And then we figured out like, this is actually a good length of time. And Franny needs to like go have a baby and be off for a while. So we'll take a break. And it just sort of became this like September through June, take a couple months off to breathe. Right. Like, but it was more or less like a birth, because I had to go give birth. And I did. Like a week and a half after our wrap-up session of that season, like I got to be in The Tempest. Our Ferdinand was like 9 months pregnant. It was me. And then we had our wrap-up session. We're like, that was great. I was like, I'll see you in the fall. And then a week and a half later, I had a baby. And then I came back.
Good timing.
And yeah, so it worked for us. So we stuck with it. 40-ish weeks is a good length of time for us.
Mhm.
Let's see, what else? So here's a question, and I wonder how we're going to answer it. So the question is, when editing, how do you balance making changes in the text that reflect more inclusive language and honoring the history? So I think that can be maybe, Molly, a question that you can answer, like coming from your research and what you found, and also like for us as an ensemble, like, you know, again, balancing like what's the intention, what's the story, and like as our friend Michaela wisely said, don't add shit to Shakespeare, right? How do we tell the story the way we understand it, staying true to the text, but then not staying like rigid about it? I don't know who wants to talk about.
Well, kind of like what I said earlier, just it like, you know, they can't really, most of us don't really understand the language. So it's really our presentation and how we show it. Because we can take lines out all day long and still show all that, and they still will understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's an interesting, on another level, you know, there's a lot in Shakespeare, like you were talking about, in terms of Taming of the Shrew, and wanting to think about being sensitive and respectful of your audience's experience. And it's a conversation that's really ongoing in the broader theater community about, you know, there's a lot of stuff in Shakespeare, and you did Othello, so you know there's a lot of stuff that's racist. You know, there's a lot of really horrible misogyny, like in Taming of the Shrew. So every company has to decide for themselves, like, do we change this line? Do we take out this line that is racist, that's essentially using a slur, or, you know, do we so I've been watching a lot. I've watched a lot of productions preparing this edition, and you can see them and see the approaches to it changing over time. So I was very interested to hear about y'all's Shrew and how you thought about that. I think it's a valuable approach for theater companies to remember that it's not just about Shakespeare. It's not just about the text. It's not just about you as performers. You know, it's about your audience and respecting where they're coming from as well. Yeah.
I also want to add that I don't honestly think that to make Shakespeare more relatable, you can honestly hold on to the original intent of what the wording was. If you want more people to become aware of it, want more people to be interested in it, we have to adapt to like society and what's going on. So although like we all were able to come to some kind of resolution, like, okay, even though we don't understand this, we want to take the time to, everybody is not at that place. So I think with making it more, I don't want to say modernized, but kind of that thing, it gives people like more understanding, like, okay, Shakespeare is for me. And that goes back to who's saying, so who's to say who is Shakespeare for? So I think with that, the adjusting and making it more relatable, I think people will be more open to it. I know I was, because it took me actually the deep. I was like, okay, this is just another group to get out of the unit. But it actually, it was Shakespeare was life changing. I'm not gonna even lie. Through SIP and just being able to dig deep into the text that we were going through, like it really changed me as an individual. And I know that with the adjustments over time, if anyone else wants to dig deep into the Shakespeare and make it more modernized, that I think it could also change a lot more people's lives because it is very relatable.
Yep.
There's a question in the text or in the chat here. Oh, Molly, I will unmute you. Because I think what general differences, and I don't know, like for me personally, I wouldn't know how to answer this, but Molly, with your research, maybe you do. What general differences are there? And I would add, if any, between Shakespeare editions edited by women as opposed to men. Do you know any kind of differences there?
I mean, I think there are some in some senses, like we've talked about, you know, everybody brings their own experience to everything that they do, including editing. And I think that, you know, I think that whether consciously or unconsciously, there are ways that you can see an editor's opinions in texts at times. In terms of the text itself being edited, I think it's, I think it's pretty rare to see like a technical decision that's made differently based on the editor's gender identity. But I don't think that's impossible. You know, I think there are some things, there are some sort of cruxes or you know, things that have to be solved in every text that I'm sure, you know, I would look at differently than somebody with a completely different life experience does. So I think it is possible at times to sort of tease out a decision that's made based on that. But I would say as a whole, the way that they're edited isn't necessarily different, but a lot of the times in terms of the women I was writing about, like I said, a lot of them are editing for different purposes. So in that sense, they are editing differently. You know, they're editing to teach for children or for other women. So in that sense, yes, there can be differences for sure.
I noted, like in my admittedly like limited ability to compare and contrast here, but because we did some of these plays that the women's ensemble explored, we also explored it in a men's ensemble over a couple of years. And I noted that I did with those plays that we had worked on in both places, that there was there were some things that just sort of got dwelled on differently. And thinking in particular about the Jessica, I know you only have a minute. I was about to ask you a question. I was going to just briefly touch on, like, in terms of women specifically, when we worked on Othello, and there is some intense, awful racism and misogyny and just all sorts of awfulness in Othello, and a lot of it emanates from Iago. And in this room full of women, we were the feeling overwhelmingly was that he was this sociopath, and he is my abusive ex, and none of this is wrong, right? Like, this is everybody's experience over and over. And Jessica was one of a couple of people who had a different understanding of him that I think was very helpful for us. And I don't know if you got to go, like I'll talk about your brilliance, but if you want to talk about it really quick.
I guess I don't remember because I think a lot of that has changed because of my experiences too, how I look at Iago, but yeah. Which part? It's just give me a little bit of an insight of what
you gave us a way to get outside of the male-female kind of the abuse and the racism piece of it. And you said, this guy is just like an addict, is what you said. Like, if you think about him as if he's a heroin addict, then this gets really straightforward because he's after that next fix, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And kind of, I mean, the hurt people kind of thing, like, he has a story too. There's something that made him the way that he was. Although I have changed my mind about that a little bit. I do think that there are some people who are incapable of empathy, and they are wired that way. But because of the fact that Iago was so driven by jealousy and pride, and he desired so much to be recognized, and so those are pretty human emotions, right? So that makes me think he's not a sociopath. Like, he is just driven. He's emotionally driven, and he hasn't been given the tools that he needs to be able to
Or like
work
narcissism.
through those emotions, or he hasn't had the people in his life that have loved him through those emotions. So yeah, I mean, I guess I was probably coming at it from a place where I'd done some really horrible things to people, and I did not want to go home and have them look at me as though I were their Iago. And I have been that to people. I think he brought it to a little, some extremes that I thankfully did not. But yeah, I mean, I think it all just comes down to not judging the character. And I mean, even when we were talking in the book about the women, we judge why did Anne do what Anne did?
And Anne
how
married
dare
the person who had, for people who don't know Richard III, Anne marries him several minutes after cursing him for killing her husband and her father-in-law. Please go on.
Yeah.
Still disappointed.
Yeah. And so we couldn't understand that. And, well, she needed to survive. Like, she was a woman in a man's world, she didn't have anybody. Like, she didn't have any family left. Her husband had just died. Like, she needed to survive. And so her instinct was to play along. I played Elizabeth as though Elizabeth did not ever love her husband, so it was just women, all of us deal with things in different ways. It doesn't mean that we're good or we're bad people. Iago, he was very hurt. He's a very hurt person. He needed a lot of hugs. So did Richard. But we looking back on Richard too, he was basically told from a really young age, like, you're ugly, there's something wrong with you. And so then he was, he felt compared to his siblings, and he was never going to be enough. If you set a child up for that, you're basically asking for them to come out of that damaged. And he did, and he damaged a lot of people because of it. And it's the same thing, a lot of what I looked at in the text did have to do with recovery and addiction, just kind of like, so we just, War of the Roses was done. There's not a whole lot going on. He's bored. He's used to chaos and turmoil. And so it's a lot like that in addiction and recovery. Like, recovery can be boring. Like, your life was pretty chaotic while you were using. And so people just stir the pot, like, just keep stirring until they can find something. And he stirred. So
he had a big spoon.
He had a pretty big spoon, pretty big pot. So
yeah. And yeah. So it was, yeah. I'm trying to think of other moments like that. But do we feel like, and we've got about 10 minutes if we want it. Like, what else do we want to talk about here? What have we not touched on yet that is important, for us to ask each other, or if any, what do we want people who are with us right now, or who are going to be watching this as a recording? Like, what do you have questions for them you would like them to explore for themselves, or just how do we want to spend? What do you want to say?
Any way of just trying to get involved with the prisons to experience it, to live it, to understand it, and then realize that that's possibly a passion that you might enjoy wanting to continue more than just a couple times.
Yeah. That's
it's definitely different behind bars, and it's definitely life-changing, whether you're the one in the blues or the ones that get to go home.
Totally.
So I would just suggest to get it out there.
Definitely.
Did you want to add something to that, Jocelyn?
Yeah, I was just want to say, with like getting more involved, also like be open to like changing your mindset, because you can only learn so much if you're stagnant in your mind. So if you open your mindset, and I feel like even for ensemble members, had we came into SIP with like this whole thing, well, this is just something that I want to do to get out of the unit, we would have never grasped, the ultimate goal that we didn't even know we were trying to get. So I feel like once you change your mindset, dig deeper, and become more involved, then I do think that they'll totally feel what we feel in the passion.
Yeah, I wish I knew who signed me up, because
Yeah,
Shakespeare definitely changed my life. I
For
just went just
sure.
because it was on my call out.
Sarah
Me
got
too.
tricked into Shakespeare. You got tricked, Jocelyn?
I didn't get tricked, but I literally signed up for everything just so that I could not be in the unit.
Yeah,
sure.
see, somebody else signed me up, and I was just like, okay,
Oh,
well.
wow.
And then it said bring a dialogue, so I was like, okay, I'll do a Napoleon Dynamite scene.
Sarah's the only person who ever actually
not-
auditioned for Shakespeare in prison.
What?
I mean, that's what I thought.
Molly, do you have any other like specific questions or things that you'd like to like pick Sarah's and Jocelyn's brains about? Or
I mean, I do feel like we could sit here for, a lot longer and
I
talk.
kind of can't. I'm still at work.
Yeah,
For
I know.
sure.
Everybody's like, we gotta go do things. But
My
I do,
awesome boss is why I'm on.
yeah, I do want to say, like, in connection with what you were saying, Jocelyn, I love this project, the sort of the way that it's like a material form and evidence of y'all's growth,
Yeah.
and I think it in itself is really wonderful, partly because it could change perceptions of
Definitely.
what people who are in prison are doing and thinking about. I mean, the level of discourse that y'all are carrying on and the
Yeah.
work that you're doing in relation to something that, as you say, so many people consider inaccessible is, I think, really is something that I think could really change how people think about this. So I want to thank y'all for letting me talk to you about it, and and getting to hear about it a little. I really appreciate it. So thank
I
you.
was constantly
too.
recruiting people. I was always telling them, like, come on, just give it a week. I'll be there with you. Like, and then
Yeah.
as far as I know, they're all still involved with Shakespeare.
Mhm.
Once you're in, you're in. That's
It's like the mafia.
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it just
Blood in,
doesn't.
blood out.
Like with the Shakespeare quotes that are still flying fast and loose, just
Oh, bloody period.
I love it.
Still one of my favorites.
Yeah. Oh my, I know that's your favorite.
Mhm.
Yeah. Were you guys talking about yelling goats and monkeys at each other?
Goats and monkeys, goats and monkeys.
Yeah. So I guess I'll close this out then by reiterating what the three of you were just touching on, which is just me having no feelings, but thinking really hard about women who, Molly, like, thank goodness that you went digging to bring all of this knowledge out, and to, even if we don't have access to the text that these women edited, just to know that they were there all along, like with these brilliant minds and perspectives and ways of working, or the ones who were working in really problematic ways too. But the fact of the matter being that they were there and they have value. And same is true for people who are incarcerated or have been incarcerated, and that there should be more Shakespeare in prisons, and there should be more, like, we should all be in dialogue with each other about this all the time.
Yeah.
So before I get all weepy, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you, Sierra, Molly, Jocelyn, Jessica, who is off in motherland, and Matthew Van Meter, our assistant director, who's been helping out behind the scenes, and Patrick Hanley, Detroit Public Theater's production manager, or director, whatever your title is. Patrick, you're wonderful, who has really been helping out behind the scenes and making this whole thing happen. And to everyone at Detroit Public Theater and all Shakespeare in Prison ensemble members and alums and facilitators and everybody, just so many wonderful people coming together around this really nerdy, wonderful topic. And if you want to find out more about Shakespeare in Prison, DetroitPublicTheater.org is a place to go and do it. And there are lots of videos you can watch. Feel free to email me, Franny at DetroitPublicTheater.org, and we can talk. Molly, amazing. Please read it.
Oh no.
Frozen. Franny, come back.
Oh, Franny.
Don't go into the light. Franny.
Uh-oh.
This is an inauspicious note to end on, but I guess, I guess that's what's happening.
That's such a great face too. She's gonna be so
I
mad.
know she's gonna be so hurt.
I just screenshotted it so I could send it to her.